Looking at prophets from the Bible, and right now we're looking at some of the prophets from the Old Testament. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the prophet Hoseah, and we read one of the texts from Hoseah in our scripture reading this morning. Today I'd like to talk with you a little bit about Hoseah, his background, the time in which he lived, and talk a little bit about the message that is found in the book of Hoseah and what we can learn and draw from that today. Hoseah was a prophet who ministered and worked in the 8th century BC. He served as a prophet for probably around 60 years, starting with the reign of Jeroboam II, and in Israel the reign of Osaka, or Amaziah as he was known. Hoseah was a contemporary of Isaiah and Micah. They were prophets who were working at the same time. Isaiah was based in the southern kingdom of Judah, and Hoseah was based in the northern kingdom of Israel. And although he talked a little bit about Judah, most of his message was directed towards the northern kingdom. Hoseah, we believe, lived to see the complete decline and collapse of the northern kingdom. We believe he died a little bit after the northern kingdom was taken into captivity by the Assyrians around 722 BC. Of course, at this time, when Hoseah began his ministry, the kingdom was at its zenith. The northern kingdom was in the middle of a very successful dynasty. Jehu had wiped out Ahab and his family, and his sons were now ruling over Israel. Jeroboam II was the king when Hoseah began his ministry. And at that time, the northern kingdom was kind of in a period of renaissance and restoration. They had secured their borders, they were at peace, the society was very prosperous. The priests of Baal and the other Canaanite gods that Ahab and Jezebel had introduced had been destroyed. So a lot of positive things seem to be going on in the northern kingdom. However, there were problems. And the biggest problem was that although Jehu did destroy Ahab and Jezebel and their family, and he did wipe out the priests of Baal and Ashtoreth, he did not wipe out idolatry in the northern kingdom. Even though God, through the prophets, had directed him in this course of action, and even though he was successful, completely successful, following the directions that God had given him through the prophets Elisha, he had some reservations. And he had concerns about whether he would be able to hold on to what he had secured. The northern kingdom was not like the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, the dynasties, the royal family changed every few generations. In the southern kingdom, the house of David ruled securely, as prophesied and promised by God to David and Solomon. Even though some of the kings were bad, the royal family continued to hold the throne. But in the northern kingdom, the throne had changed many, many times. After the initial king had not followed God's directions, the throne was taken away from his family. And every 2 or 3 generations, sometimes not even that, sometimes even just a short period, 6 months or a year, the king was assassinated or murdered or died in battle, and one of his generals or someone else took the throne. There was no stability in the north like there was in the south. And so when Jehu did get the throne for him and his family, and even though he wiped out Ahab, who was the king and all of his family, he still had some doubts. And so to maintain his independence from the southern kingdom and the influence of the southern kingdom, and to make himself unique, he continued the policy of the worship of the golden calves. These had been set up by the first king, Jeroboam, and to make sure the people didn't go back to Jerusalem to worship and perhaps decide to reaffirm their loyalty to the southern kingdom and to the house of David. And so Jehu and his family continued to support this worship of these two golden calves, one at Bethel and the other at Dan, at the northern end of the kingdom. And in fact, his son or grandson, Jeroboam II, was named after the founder of the northern kingdom as another attempt to link his dynasty to the foundation of the northern kingdom, trying to achieve some amount of respectability and longevity. And so, because the people were not following God, they were following these other golden calves and worshiping there. The kingdom, although peaceful, although materially successful as trade came through the crossroads there that the northern kingdom was situated on, even though they were prosperous, even though they were peaceful, the society was not getting better. The society was not following God's plans. They were following the morality and the values and the ways of their neighbors as they worshiped these golden calves. And the society was in a state of moral decline. And so Hoseah was called to turn the attention of the people and the kings to God. God had been the person God had founded their kingdom. God had given the king and his family this power. And they were ignoring and turning away from the source of their power, their strength, their salvation. And so Hoseah was called to call attention to this, to turn the people's thoughts and eyes to this situation, to realize what they were doing. And the book of Hoseah starts out in a very unusual way. How many of you are married? A few of us, okay. Now, when you were thinking about getting married, what kind of person did you think about? You know, usually people have some sort of image or idea or values that they're thinking about. When I first came to Japan, I heard that there were 3 things that Japanese women wanted. They wanted someone who was tall, handsome, and rich. So I told my wife she's lucky. She got 2 out of 3. She wasn't happy about not missing the 3rd one. But everyone has certain values or things they're looking for when they're choosing a wife or a husband. Whether it's education or personality or economic security, there are different things that we are looking for when we choose a husband or a wife. And in the book of Hoseah, Hoseah was not given that option at all. In fact, in the book of Hosea chapter 1, God told Hosea, "I've chosen someone for you to marry. Her name is Gomer." And Hosea was rather shocked by this command because Gomer was not your typical average Jewish or Israelite woman. Gomer was a prostitute. She worked in a brothel. And God directed Hosea to marry this prostitute and take her home and make her his wife. Now, I don't know about any of the rest of you, but I would have serious reservations if God told me to marry a prostitute. You know, there are a lot of dangers and risks, health risks, emotional problems that these people have. You know, that's a real challenge to take that kind of a relationship. And yet, we don't read that Hoseah resisted or questioned God at all. He went down and he did exactly as God commanded. And, it would be nice if the story could be, he rescued this woman from sin and embraced her and they had a happy life together after that. Unfortunately, that is not what happened. After Hoseah married this woman, she went back to her old life. She was not happy living with him, and she left him. But only after they had a first son. They had a son, and God directed him to name the son Jezreel, which Jezreel was the name of a place, but it was also a place of war and fighting and death and destruction. And the meaning of this first son was that, there's going to be death and destruction for Israel. Now, how many of you are parents? Now, if you're naming your children, usually you think of something positive, right? You want a name that's maybe a little unique or different, something that has a nice sound to it. In Japanese, they want kanjis, choosing the kanji, what the kanji looks like. My mother, when she chose my name, she goes, well, I didn't know any marks. I wanted a different name that not everybody else had. John, David, those are common names. Lots of Johns, a lot of Sams, but there were no Marks that I knew, so I gave you the name Mark. When I was thinking about the names for my children, my wife said, well, we want names that you can say in English and Japanese. We want to be able to pronounce both names so they're kind of similar. So I went through a whole list of names, went through websites and found a bunch of names that other foreigners had posted. And I gave my wife a list. I said, these are the ones that I found. Which ones do you like? She said, oh, I don't like any of these. And I was like, okay, you choose. But, we, as parents, we think about names. Names are important. We want names that have some special meaning to us. Maybe the original meaning of the name in the language. Maybe it's a person that we respect. An ancestor, a father, a grandfather, or uncle. Names have special meaning. And so, when God told Hoseah to give this name to his son, I'm sure Hoseah was a little bit disappointed because it was not a positive name. It was a name that had a very negative meaning. And it was designed to be a message to the people of Israel. Whenever they heard that boy's name, when they spoke his name, when his name was called, it was to remind the people that death and war and destruction was coming to their kingdom, even though they were living in the midst of peace and tranquility at that time. And so, Hoseah's wife had this baby and she abandoned the baby and Hoseah and she went back to working as a prostitute. We don't know for how long, but Hoseah struggled on, and then God told Hoseah, go back and get your wife and bring her home. And so he did. He went down, he found her, and he had to purchase her to bring her back because she had some contract or she had accumulated a certain amount of debt as she was living away from him. And he had to pay 30 pieces of silver, which was the standard price for a slave at that time. Well, a total value of about 30 pieces of silver, some food and some coin. He had to buy his wife back. He had to redeem her from the life that she had chosen to return to. And after this, they had a daughter. And again, God told Hoseah to give this daughter a special name. And the name translated into English is not a very nice one. You are not my people. You are not mine. Now, we don't know if that actually means that this daughter was the daughter of one of Gomer's customers, or whether it was her, whether it was Hoseah's, and God simply told him to give this name. And again, a very negative name. You know, how many of you would be happy if your parents said, "Oh, I'm going to give you a name, you know, not mine, not my son, not my daughter." It's not a very positive thing. You know, imagine being a child and growing up with that name. And yet, again, this name was a message. It was a warning to the people that they were not God's people because they weren't following and doing what God had commanded them to do. And, of course, this is a message we find in the New Testament as well. When Jesus talked with his disciples, you know, how will they know you are my followers? Well, you keep my commandments. You do what I tell you, what God has commanded you to do. If you follow God's commandments, if you keep his commandments, you are identified as being sons and daughters of God. You can't claim to be a son or daughter of God if you're not doing the will of the Father. And Jesus told a parable about that, right? The farmer, he had 2 sons. And the farmer went to his first son and said, "Please go out and work in the field today. We got a lot of work to do." And the first son said, "I'm busy. I'm not going to do it. I have other things to do." And the father was disappointed, and he went to the second son, and he said to the second son, "Oh, can you go and work in the fields?" And the second son said, "Sure, Dad, I'll do it." And then he didn't. He stayed home and decided to do something else. But the first son, he began to feel badly about his rude treatment to his father, and so he relented. He changed his mind, and he went out and he worked in the fields all day. And Jesus asked the crowd, well, which one did the will of his father? Simple answer, right? The first son. Even though the first son refused, he had a change of heart, and he went and he did what the father had asked. While the second son had agreed to do it, but had done nothing. We have an English expression, actions speak louder than words. It is what we do that matters. We are going to be judged by our fruits, the Bible tells us. Words are cheap. Talk is cheap. It's easy to say, "We'll do it," or "I'll help you," or "Yeah, I'm a Christian." It's easy. It's only words. It is by action. It is by living and doing what God has called us to do that we demonstrate, that we show we are truly his family. And so God told Hoseah to name his daughter, "You are not mine, you are not my people." Because even though the people thought that they were God's people, and they put on the airs, and they claimed that they were following God, they weren't. They were worshiping these other idols. They were doing as they pleased. They were not treating their neighbors with love. The society had become centered around materialism, which is a lot like we are today. The society was in moral decline and moral decay. And that's what we are looking at as we look at the news today. And so Hoseah followed God's direction, and he named the daughter this name. And again, his wife, even though she was at home, she was not really a good wife or a good mother. And Hoseah had many struggles with her as he continued to live with her and to be a father to his children and a husband to his wife. And they finally had one last son. And let's see, what was the name of him? I forgot where he... I don't remember the third son's name.
Leon.
was the Roma was the wife or the daughter. Anyway, Hoseah. So in these first few chapters where we read about this process of these sons and daughters and the interaction with his wife, we are given a parable, a living parable of the relationship between God and the kingdom of Israel, between God and the royal family. The people of Israel have been rescued by God. In the beginning, they had been brought out of Egypt. God had called Israel out of Egypt. He had brought them to this land. And even after the kingdom divided, the northern kingdom had been promised and blessed by God. And its rulers had been promised and blessed by God if they would continue to follow and worship Him. And yet, even though they had received these blessings, even though they had received prosperity and peace, they refused to recognize God as the source of that. And instead of embracing God, they embraced idols. They turned away from God, just like Hoseah's wife turned away from him. His wife was a symbol for the country of Israel. And Hoseah was a symbol for God. His love, his patience, his redeeming of his wife, his caring for her and caring for the children, despite all of the things that she did, despite her lack of loyalty, despite her lack of love for him and her children, he still was faithful to her and to his family. He did not abandon them. He did not turn away from her or from the children that they had. And this was intended to be a living object lesson, a living warning and message and call to the people as to how they were relating to God. Of course, people talked about what happened. I'm sure people were surprised. And at the time that this message was given, at the time that these warnings first came, people probably laughed because it was a time of prosperity. It was a time of peace. But this would change. And by the end of Hoseah's ministry, within a period of just 50 to 60 years, the northern kingdom completely collapsed. And the warnings that Hoseah gave, which we read in the chapters that follow, from chapters 4 to 14, Hoseah specifically talks about the individual problems of Israel, their immorality, their idolatry, their lack of love, their selfishness. He points out these problems and says, if you don't change, if you don't turn from these things, bad things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen to you and to your kingdom. And the warning was to the people and to the king. And these things did happen. Jehu's family did not remain in power. 3 generations, and they were replaced by other kings. And the kings that followed, they did not establish royal houses either. Most of them only lasted a single generation, if that. The northern kings became more and more corrupt, more and more wicked, more and more evil, and they did not listen or follow anything that God tried to share to them, or share with them, through the prophets, of which Hoseah was the longest continuous prophet to the northern kingdom for these 60 years leading up to their destruction. We don't know exactly what happens to Hoseah. The Bible does not give us a final history of his life and how it ended. There are various traditions related to him and his prophecy and his role as a prophet. There are some that say he died of old age and at peace in the last years of Hezekiah. and just after the kingdom was conquered. There are others who said that he was taken captive by the Assyrians and that he died in Babylon. Local Arabs point to an area there in northern Israel and claim that that is the grave of Hoseah, even today. So we don't really know what happened to Hoseah. There's no inference in either the New or Old Testament that he suffered any kind of a martyr's death like some of the other prophets. But he did serve for many years, and he is one of the first prophets who recorded all of his messages in writing and left written records that he himself had recorded. What value do we find in the messages of Hoseah today? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Hoseah's message came at a time of peace and prosperity. People were satisfied, people were comfortable, people felt safe. And the world was one that was in moral decline. People were living as they wanted. They were doing things their own way. They were self-centered, looking at what was good for them and ignoring the plight or the problems of people around them. Does that sound familiar to any of you? You know, we look around us today and we live in a very prosperous world. Now, it's true there are areas that suffer from poverty. The developing world, many challenges. But for those of us living in first world countries like the U.S. or Japan, we live a very comfortable life. We have many, many comforts and many, many amenities, many, many things that we just sort of take for granted. We don't really think anything about these conveniences until something bad happens. You know, oh, the water's out. Oh, what am I going to do? How am I going to wash my clothes? Or how am I going to take a shower? Or, oh, the hot water stops working. Oh, how am I going to heat water? How am I going to take a hot shower? You know, we become accustomed to all of these good things. We don't realize all of the benefits that we have. We just sort of take them all for granted. Most of us are quite comfortable. We have jobs. We're making enough money to pay our bills, to put food on the table. And even here in Japan, there are people who are not always so fortunate. We have homeless people living here in Osaka. Even in the middle of the city, you know, you walk along the street and you'll see some guy or sometimes an old woman sleeping on cardboard or pushing a little cart, or you know, there are people that are not as fortunate as us, even in a society as advanced as it's developed as is. And yet today, many people are still only focused on themselves. They're only concerned about what's good for me. Even though there are these people that need help around us that we can see, a lot of people just kind of look the other way. You know, or they just sort of blend into the scenery. You know, we've seen them so many times, we just don't notice them anymore. And we become blind and deaf to the calls and the sights of this trouble that exists around us. When we talk about morality, we look at what we see on TV, the music that is popular today, the books, the magazines. The world has become a very, very sensually centered society. You know, sex sells. Television, you know, the language, the nudity, the situations are becoming more and more graphic, more and more adult, mature audience only. You know, even in my lifetime, and I'm 50-odd years old, you know, there's been a big change that I have witnessed. in the levels of public morality in the United States. And we've just become so accustomed to it, even when it's something that, would be so shocking to us 20 or 30 years ago. We just accept it as, well, that's the way it is now. That's what society accepts, so, we'll just have to sort of grin and bear it. As Christians, we can't be like frogs. If you put a frog in a pan of water and you start turning up the heat, the frog will just sit there, even though it gets hotter and hotter, and it'll die in the pan. It just acclimates to the change of temperature until it finally is killed by the high heat. As Christians, we can't be like a frog. We can't be like a toad. We can't allow ourselves to acclimate to the world. We can't allow ourselves to be desensitized to the problems and the challenges and the troubles around us. And it's not easy because we're bombarded by these things every day. We are influenced by the society in which we live. How can we maintain our Christian values? How can we maintain our sensitivity in such challenging environments? And the answer is very simple. We have to be in contact with God. We have to be looking at Christ. We have to remind ourselves on a daily basis who and what we are and what we believe. It is only as we constantly stay in contact and in communion with God through the Holy Spirit that we can maintain the sensitivity, that we can maintain the values that we should be following if we're going to be called children of God. In the New Testament, it says that they will know we are Christians by our love. If we are not living a life of love, we are not Christians. And we're only going to know what true love is, not by watching TV or reading magazines or novels. We're only going to know that by looking at Christ. So I challenge each of you, each day and every day, to look at Christ, reflect on His love, and reflect that love to other people. Thank you.